Okay. Welcome everyone to From Me Too to Prevention, a bystander intervention training for public history and museum professionals. We're so excited that you were able to join us today, even amidst all of this kind of weird and scary world we're in right now. My name is Chelsea Miller and I use they, them pronouns. I'm the communications director at the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and I also do consulting work as public humanist, which ranges from editorial support to consulting on organizational policies. And before I got into anti-violence work, I worked in museums, scholarly publishing, and higher education. And I'm also on the NCPH Digital Media Committee. And I'm joined by Michelle Carroll, who I will let introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Carroll. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I was formerly the Associate Director of NRAPE on campus, and I was also the Director of Campus Projects for the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Right now I'm consulting, and so my information is up there on the slide if you're interested in getting in touch with me. But generally, I provide support in regards to training, prevention and response training topics, as well as organizational policy review. So get in touch with me and I'd be happy to help you out. Yeah, so let's ask, what brought you to this workshop? If you would chime in on the chat button.
Pause for a second.
Yeah, I think we have to, right?
There's somebody in here who I am going to name and call out right
John
now.
Western.
Someone called John Western just sent to us and panelists. Let's slap some titties around. Hey, so that didn't go to all attendees, but I'm just going to say right now that that is not acceptable and we're not going to allow that here.
Yeah, and John Western, I think you might be in the wrong workshop.
Yeah, you're in the wrong place, my dude.
But if you want to stick around and learn about bystander intervention and how you can become a person who is a community activist, someone who promotes community care, then stick around. But if you're just going to do that, then we're going to ask you to leave.
Yeah, they left.
Oh,
so
peace out. Oh.
Back to business. Thank you, Kristen. I will report that. I took a screenshot.
Oh, look at
so
reacting. But
yeah, so
anyway,
thank you.
We wanted to ask if you would share in the chat box what brought you to this workshop today. I know Chelsea shared that they found their way to this work after working in publishing, but I started doing sexual assault organizing in 2009 when I was a freshman in college. I don't really like to think about how long that's been, but it's been a while that I've been involved in these issues. But so what brought you here? I see on the chat box that a lot of folks are shouting out Chelsea's awesome workshop that was offered at last year's conference, which I'm not surprised because Chelsea's brilliant and amazing.
I see just a plug, Michelle was there last year too, just virtually.
I was there virtually, yes. In my soul.
We see people that have experienced harassment and discrimination so far. Oh, thank you.
I see some folks are talking about how this topic interacts with their professional lives, which I think makes a lot of sense because, you know, in the museum profession, you interact with folks at different levels, and since sexual violence is a issue that affects all people at all levels of their life, that it just makes sense that you would interact with this topic in your professional life. Chelsea, this is like the Chelsea fan club.
Hi.
I love Chelsea. Chelsea's so great, which is great. We're so glad. Whatever brings you in, we're happy to have you because, you know, this is a conversation that we need to engage with, you know, often, right? Right, Chelsea?
Yeah.
I know the way I practice bystander intervention is different now than when I first learned. in college, and I know that the tools that I use now for bystander intervention look very different than the tools that I used at 22 years old. So
Mhm.
this is really a skill set that grows with you as you as you experience different things and join different communities. So I'm just happy that all y'all are here today.
Yeah. Ooh.
Mm,
So this John Western person is still around
God,
saying sup sluts. So really, this is just not acceptable. Like,
so terrible.
it's not okay. Anyways, we're going to keep moving.
Yeah.
So traditionally, the next step is to establish community agreements. So we like to share our ground rules, and then you're able to share something if you want to. First, take care of yourself. We realize that there might be folks here who are listening who have experienced sexual violence in some capacity before. And so please take care of yourself in whatever way is healthy for you and really for everybody. If you need to just take a step away, go get some water, please do that. Our second rule is to speak respectfully. We really, even if we disagree, we commit to, sharing our thoughts respectfully.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to commit to that and expect everybody to do so as well. So thank you, Michelle.
Yeah. Let's see. If anyone has other community agreements that they'd like to share, please throw them into the chat box, whether that is appropriate for this space right now, this virtual space, or if it is a community agreement that you use in in-person meetings. I know I'm always collecting ideas. I don't know about you, Chelsea, but I assume so.
Yeah, always, always. So we're going to start today by answering some common questions about sexual violence, and we'll follow with a brief explanation and kind of exploration of the prevalence of sexual violence and discrimination in the public history community specifically. Then we'll talk about the bystander intervention approach to sexual violence, and we'll practice it with some scenarios. Then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So if you have content questions, please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box. Just know that we're going to check them later on. So by the end of this training this afternoon, you'll have some sense of how to intervene as a bystander to prevent not just sexual violence, but any kind of violence. And we'll also provide information about how to connect with local sexual violence experts in your community. So now I will turn it over to Michelle.
Great. Thanks, Chelsea. Do we want to use the captions, by the way?
Yes.
Let's try.
Yeah.
Chelsea brilliantly realized that you can utilize, what is this, Google Sheets?
Google Sheets or Google Play.
Great. To use
PowerPoint.
captions. It's super slow though. Oh well, we're gonna give it a go. All right, so Chelsea, you wanna throw up the first poll? Before we really dive into information about sexual violence and prevalence rates, take a second to engage with the poll that Chelsea just threw up. Let us know how many of you have taken part in a training about sexual violence before. We're asking so that I can tailor some of this information. So if you're not sure if you've done a training, put I'm not sure. Shout out to the person who shared.
That's legit.
That's legit. I'm not sure. All right. So I think most of us have already, a couple more just came through. I love this app, I gotta say. All right. So it looks like we're about 50-ish. So I'm going to take some time to really go through this information and make sure we're all on the same page. Chelsea, will you throw up the second poll, which is, let us know, have you ever taken part in, I think that's what I do. I think I have to press it. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Is the second poll?
We've got the second poll.
Nope, that's my poll, or that's the first poll.
Close the window.
Got it. Chelsea's so good at technology. Have you ever encountered the term bystander intervention before today? Is this a term that you've heard before? Is it a term that you've never seen before? Let us know so that we can take the appropriate amount of time to really walk through this. Okay, it seems like a good number of us have heard it before. Okay, but there are a fair number of us who are not familiar with the term, which is totally fine. We're going to take that time today to really go through it. Should I end the poll, Chelsea? Okay, I'm going to do that. And I'm going to share results. And I'm going to stop sharing. Oh my God, this is so complicated. Okay, great. So thank you so much for sharing that information about you. I'm going to spend some time going through sort of the fundamentals of sexual violence, assault, and harassment. Chelsea, will you go to the next slide? Awesome. So what is sexual violence? The CDC defines sexual violence as any sexual act that is perpetuated against someone's will. It's a term that encompasses a range of harmful and violent activities, which can include a completed non-consensual sexual act like rape, an attempted non-consensual sexual acts or abusive sexual contact, which could be unwanted touching or harassment, or a non-contact sexual abuse, like threatened sexual violence, exhibitionism, or verbal sexual harassment. My immediate reaction here is thinking about non-contact sexual abuse that happens online, which I think we're going to see a lot of now that we're spending a lot of time online. Chelsea, we go to the next slide. Okay. So what is affirmative consent? The opposite of sexual assault and sexual violence is affirmative consent. But let's walk through what this is, what it sounds like, what it looks like, so we can identify it. So affirmative consent is clear and unambiguous agreement at every stage of a sexual encounter, whether it's kissing, touching, or having sex. Affirmative consent cannot be assumed. Silence or lack of resistance does not demonstrate consent. In fact, it demonstrates a lack of consent, right? So if you're not feeling or you're not seeing obvious encouragement, that is a lack of consent. I want to really emphasize that because I know that goes against some misconceptions that are really culturally ingrained in the way Americans understand our sexual script and what sex looks like. Consent can be given with words or actions. It's important to include nonverbal cues as indicators of consent, right? Because there are a number of folks who can express themselves in various degrees. And so there is, there needs to be an understanding that, that there are verbal ways to consent, right? You can't rely on a past sexual interaction to infer that there is consent in the current sexual interaction. Moreover, consent for sexual actions does not imply consent for other actions, right? When sexual activities are consensual, it means that those involved have agreed to what they are doing and have given their permission. And sex acts that occur without someone's agreement or permission is rape or sexual violence. So this is really particularly relevant for folks that work in the college space. You may have seen this phrase affirmative consent before. It may even be in your university policies. If it's not, it would be great to include it, and we could talk about that later. But for folks of you that are in New York or in California, you probably are really familiar with this definition. Because there are state laws that mandate that you use the affirmative consent definition when evaluating sexual misconduct at your universities. So I think I'll just share what the definition of affirmative consent is in New York because both Chelsea and I worked in New York. And to be honest, it's my favorite definition. So the state of New York and all 440 universities in New York State define affirmative consent as a knowing, voluntary, and mutual decision among all participants to engage in sexual activity. Consent can be given by words or actions as long as those words or actions create clear permission regarding willingness to engage in that sexual activity. Silence or lack of resistance in and of itself does not constitute consent, and the definition of consent does not vary based upon a person's sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. Great job, New York. That's a really complete definition. Let's go to the next slide since I really beat that definition in.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna say, I apologize, everyone, the captions are not working right now, so they're not self-updating.
I thought so, because it was weird on my end, but
if you can see it on your end, folks who are attending, let us know, but I've turned it off for now.
Great. Would you go to the next slide? Awesome. All right. So it's impossible to talk about sexual violence and what sexual violence looks like without really understanding how power can present in a sexual relationship. So sexual violence is not about sex. It is about power and expression of power. In the past and in the present, sexual violence has been used as a tool of oppression and maintains hierarchies of power, specifically in the context of sexual violence experienced by Black women, Native women, LGBTQ women, trans and gender nonconforming people, and people with disabilities. And so we're really emphasizing that because I think if you take a moment to really consider the epidemic of sexual violence that is experienced by these groups, these marginalized groups, you'll see that there is an expression of power, right? Because if you're able to control a whole group of people through sexual violence, it's easy to make sure they don't show up at the polls on voting day, right? So victims and survivors of sexual violence are affected by many forms of oppression, including racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, ageism, ableism, and others. These factors can compound the effects of sexual violence, that is, can compound the way that a single person experiences that violence in their life, exacerbating trauma that they may already have, and then further isolating victims and survivors as they experience this violence. So let's see. So I think it's also important to mention, and Chelsea's notes are excellent in reminding me this, that forms of oppression and systematic inequalities make it very difficult for a person who has experienced sexual violence and may also experience other forms of oppression to report that violence. And so it may be difficult for them to feel that they'll be believed, to feel that the state and the state's apparatus is going to back them up, is going to investigate, is going to take this violence seriously. And so just as we're thinking about how folks experience sexual violence, it's really important to remember that not everybody goes to the police or expects the police to get involved in their story. Chelsea, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about how power can show up in folks who do public history work.
Yeah, so in places where people do public history, as many of you know, there are a lot of hierarchies and power dynamics at play. So we're thinking particularly of the relationships between like professors and their students, senior scholars and senior staff, and junior scholars and staff, as well as paid staff and interns, volunteers, consultants, and contract workers. There are a lot of cases where your state's workplace discrimination laws will provide protection, but there are some scenarios where that's not the case, like for consultants and unaffiliated researchers, or unwanted sexual advances and sexual harassment that occurs at conferences. And as Michelle talked about, so if you're a student or a professor, you will have some state laws that provide protection and information. On a federal level, there's Title IX, which I'm sure that Michelle would love to talk about later, that can provide protections for students.
Awesome. So knowing how prevalent or these power relationships can be in our life, and how these power relationships can lead to or allow for sexual violence to occur, Let's talk a little bit about how a person can respond when they experience sexual violence. Great. All right, so there are short and long-term effects of experiencing sexual violence. And we know this based on a variety of scientific studies that have happened, over the last 30 years. And so I think it's really important that folks of us who have power in our workplace can really understand and identify how sexual violence can impact someone. So we know that in the short term, someone can experience a variety of emotional impacts like disbelief and sadness, anxiety, anger, irritability, neediness. I mean, there's feeling numb, there's mood swings, distrust, fear, or low self-esteem. I think we can just really underline that by saying a immediate emotional change in someone is a symptom, I think, of having experienced sexual violence. Physiologically, in the short term, a survivor can experience body aches and pains as a result of the high amount of stress and anxiety that they're feeling. We know that survivors in the short term experience difficulty sleeping, and so that can result in a variety of other physiological issues. There are changes in eating and sleeping patterns, nightmares, an increased startle response, and the start of post-traumatic stress disorder. We know that mentally, in the short term, a survivor can have difficulty with concentration and comprehension, and they can experience flashbacks, which would make it difficult for them to participate in the life that they had been living prior to experiencing this violence. And we also know that in the short term and long term, the experience of sexual violence can change the way a person's brain functions, which will then change the way a person functions, right? Our brain, is in charge of everything. I am not a scientist and I am not a doctor, but this is something that I have learned as an advocate for sexual violence, that there is a very real change in how a person experiences their life. And so we know that after experiencing sexual violence, a person's amygdala, which is in their brain, which is the part of the brain that is really attuned to fear and anxiety. We know that after someone experiences an incident of sexual violence, that piece of their brain, the amygdala, can become more activated, can become more likely to be activated, and a person can ultimately find themselves living a life where they are feeling like they're experiencing that same level of fear and anxiety as they experienced during a sexual violence incident. All of this is to say that it's very difficult for someone who's experienced sexual violence, who's not getting the help that they need, to function at work and function at school. I know that was a lot to say, but I'm really just trying to show you that there are a variety of after effects and impacts that can make it really difficult for someone to be successful in the way that they were prior to experiencing sexual violence. So if you would just chime into the chat box after I went through all of that, the variety of ways that somebody can experience sexual assault, what are some of the ways that you think this could impact someone at work? What are the ways that someone could, after experiencing sexual violence, how could that impact their work? I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So if you just chime into the chat box. I know that when I'm working with student survivors, they're frequently sharing with me that after experiencing sexual assault, there was a rise in absences, tardiness, and difficulty concentrating. So they weren't able to really fully participate in school anymore. Someone shared that they may no longer feel safe in the space that they're working, especially if the incident happened at work. But even if it didn't happen at work, it is very likely that there are experiences, there are things that could happen at work that make someone be reminded of that incident. Let's see. I also know from working with students that that students also experience a number of issues sleeping and stomach aches and headaches. And these are things that they deal with on the day-to-day, and that makes it difficult to go to class. Chelsea, any ideas on your end about how we could see this present in the workplace?
Yeah, you might notice that your coworker, or maybe if you're a supervisor, your supervisee is, having trouble getting to work on time, coming into work, maybe is having a hard time concentrating. They might be kind of really confused or irritable. Yeah, you see someone who might be self-isolating at work.
Yeah.
Really, any significant changes in behavior can be a symptom or a sign that something has happened.
And that's not to say that you should go in guns blazing and say, have you been a victim of sexual assault? Like, that is not the way to get somebody to talk to you about their experience. That's a whole other conversation, actually, for how to use that moment of trust and create a foundation for healthy healing for that individual, right? But we just really want you to think in the back of your mind, okay, how can sexual violence really impact someone at work, so that you're understanding the seriousness of this.
Yeah, and I want to echo what was just entered into the chat.
Yeah.
This could also cause a lot of internal guilt. So like feeling guilty you can't concentrate or can't work, quite to the capacity that you had before. Yeah, that's real. And to reiterate too, when it has happened in the workplace, it can create a culture of fear and distrust among colleagues. And yeah, definitely to like affirm Michelle's comment, this isn't a moment to kind of go in and ask someone directly necessarily, but to express care and your concern, and really kind of ask somebody what's going on.
In a generalized way.
Yeah.
Right.
Which ties into our next.
Exactly.
Yep. And to echo a comment that just went into the chat, if you're responding in the chat, can you make sure you're chatting to all panelists and attendees? If you're just sending it to panelists, only Michelle and I can see it.
Chelsea, will you go to the next slide? Great. So let's say that someone does decide to disclose to you. What can you do? I have a whole other presentation on that, but just to like really give you, I guess, the highlights of that, listen. Immediately listen to the person as they're sharing with you. Believe them. Whether that is literally saying, I believe you, or I hear you, just remind them that you believe them. Next, I would also say, verbally remind this person that what happened to them was not their fault. We've gone through, I think, a lot of information in this webinar, but something that Chelsea and I have really emphasized is that sexual violence is never the fault of the person that experienced it. And while a victim or survivor may experience feelings of self-guilt and self-blame, it's really important to, at every point, just reiterate that those feelings are not true, and that it is not their fault. Let's see. Rather than ask someone, to tell you more about the incident, that's not really important, right? Instead, ask them, what can I do for you? What can I help you with right now? And then do the things that they said. If they're not sure what to do, or not sure what to do now that they've told you, which is a very, very real reaction, make sure that after this webinar, take 5 to 10 minutes to Google local community resources, so that if you do find yourself in this situation, you can share those resources with whomever you're speaking with. We have up on the slide some some examples of resources that you can familiarize yourself with. There's the National Sexual Assault Hotline, which I really recommend because when you encourage someone to call that hotline or engage with the chat hotline, which they can do online, they actually give someone the local resources that are available to them. So that's the phone numbers and websites, which I know can sound like very basic, but for someone who's in crisis, it's really difficult to Google information to get help. And so just having just knowing that there is a hotline that you can share with folks so that they can get the most pertinent resources, that's just an excellent thing to be familiar with. So there's a number for you. Above all, when you are listening to someone, believing someone, etc., support them in making their own decisions and choices, right? Experiencing sexual violence takes the power away from someone, right? Because we talked about how sexual violence is an expression of power. And so when you're listening to a victim or survivor, you want to do everything possible to give them their power back. And you can do that by making them in charge of what happens next. So encourage a survivor to make their own choices. You can allow them to decide to lead in the phone call, but you can also offer to sit with them if you feel like that's appropriate. But also make sure you're not pushing someone to make a decision, to make an action. You're not pushing someone to call the police. You're not pushing someone to go to the hospital to get a forensic rape examination. Instead, you are giving them the power to make decisions and how things unfold next. Let's see. I guess the last thing I would like to emphasize before I return it to Chelsea, who can really get into how this is going to show up in the public history community, is I really would just like to emphasize to everyone that your local rape crisis program is free. Their services are free. And so just contact them, ask them what they can do for you, ask them what they can do for your students, and just utilize your local resources. They get state and federal funding. If they don't use that funding, they get less funding next year. And so just give them a call. That's about that. Chelsea, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, so as you all know, the Me Too movement has shed light on the prevalence of gender discrimination and sexual violence, including in scholarly and professional communities. And over the past year, we've seen that the public history community is no exception. So we're going to take a second to look at the prevalence of sexual violence in this particular community, as well as how it impacts us as a whole. So in September 2018, the American Historical Association published the results of its own survey on sexual harassment and gender discrimination at AHA annual meetings in the past 5 years. Almost 15% had heard sexist comments uttered in their presence, and 10% had been the object of behavior that made them uncomfortable, like leerings or staring. 77 respondents received unwanted attempts to establish a sexual relationship at least once. Slightly more than 1% felt bribed to engage in sexual behavior with some sort of reward or sexual treatment or special treatment. And nearly 1% reported being threatened with retaliation for not being sexually cooperative. Finally, 5% experienced being touched without their consent in a way that made them uncomfortable. So that's at one meeting over 5 years. At NCPH's 2018 annual meeting, the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force, shout out, held an on-the-fly session on sexual harassment and gender discrimination in public history. And they asked participants to tell their own stories on sticky notes that were exhibited throughout the room. The task force also conducted an online survey where respondents shared stories that highlight how, where, and when public historians experience harassment and discrimination. Between these two avenues, people shared experiences ranging from witnessing sexist and objectifying comments to being misgendered, to witnessing or experiencing sexually explicit, inappropriate behavior in the workplace. It's really important to note that any data we have on sexual violence and its prevalence only scratches the surface. We just have reports of things that are disclosed. We don't have a sense of incidents that are never disclosed or reported. And folks might be silent for many reasons, and some of you may have experienced this, including fear of not being believed, fear of retaliation, or fear and mistrust of the systems you might encounter when you do disclose, whether it's the criminal legal system or the medical system or even your workplace. So shout out to Mary Rizzo, who I know is here. So sexual harassment and gender discrimination disempowers and marginalizes people of all races, gender identities, and sexual orientations. They're also violations of workers' rights. Public historians have been advocates for more equitable working conditions in a variety of ways, including paid internships and more support for people of color in predominantly white institutions. Ending sexual harassment and gender discrimination is an equally critical part of our efforts to diversify our field, wrote Mary Rizzo in a blog post for History at Work. So this is a monumental task, and we're not going to end sexual violence with like one virtual training or with one method necessarily, but we are going to focus on one prevention approach. A lot of different groups have focused efforts on stopping victimization. Others focus on working with potential harm doers, and others work to strengthen responsive services for victims and survivors. Above all, each approach shares the goal of creating a safe community, supporting the person who's experienced harm, and to hold the harm doer accountable for the harm they've caused. So we're going to spend some time, as you might expect, looking at bystander intervention specifically. And I'm going to turn it over to Michelle.
Okay, awesome. Will you go to the next slide, Chelsea? Woohoo! Oh wait, I think we jumped ahead. Yes, okay, great. So if you wouldn't mind, in the chat box, when we say bystander intervention, what do you think of? Do you associate something else with those words? If so, please just share in the chat box. I know I'm curious. But when we're talking about bystander intervention in regards to community care, we're talking about a set of tools that would allow a person to intervene either directly or indirectly in an incident that could be violent or dangerous for the person experiencing it. Oh, we got some folks sharing. Yeah, so people are talking about preventing escalation by intervening. So preventing an incident from becoming more violent or an incident that might be more verbal to turning into something that becomes physically violent. Someone shared, I think of the bystander effect and Kitty Genovese, which makes a lot of sense, I think. And I believe that is the story of the young woman who in Brooklyn, at least in New York City, definitely, was violently attacked. And I guess like her whole community had heard her. I feel like I shouldn't even be like telling this story to a group of historians. I'm a little concerned. But what we do know about the story is that this woman was violently murdered, and while her whole community had heard her, no one intervened or reacted or called the police. So I think that's something that we can think about. But when we think about bystander intervention, we're thinking more active, right? We're thinking not to be a bystander, so the complete opposite. Stepping in personally or calling the police in overt situations. I'm glad someone shared that. I know Chelsea and I talk a lot about when to call the police or when it is appropriate to call the police. So I thank you for sharing, Paul, and we're going to really dive into that a little bit more. So, bystander intervention is the act of someone intervening when they see or hear behaviors that promote violence before it escalates. We have a quote from Victoria Banyard, who is recognized as like a real leader in community care and bystander intervention. And she writes that the bystander approach offers opportunities to build communities and a society that does not allow sexual violence. It gives everyone in the community a specific role in preventing the community's problem of sexual violence. And Vicki really hits the nail on the head here about why the bystander intervention is such like a complete package. Because as someone in the community, we all have a role in keeping each other safe, and the bystander intervention approach really allows us to do that. Let's go to the next slide. Great. So the benefits of using bystander intervention, before we even get into how to do it, let's just give you, I'm really just trying to get you to get excited about using these things, but bystander intervention discourages victim blaming and shifts the responsibility to the community. And this is like really essential because as we talked about in the previous section, sexual violence, there's a lot of silence around it, right? Folks are afraid of coming forward. Folks are nervous about sharing these experiences. Folks feel a lot of shame in experiencing them. And so instead of promoting this silence, bystander intervention really breaks the silence and encourages folks to move away from conversations of how could you let this happen, or why didn't you say something, why didn't you do something to stop it, and instead moves the conversation to how can we prevent this from happening. With bystanders as active participants, the sense of responsibility in preventing sexual violence rightfully moves away from the individual survivor and instead towards family, friends, coworkers, and the entire community. The question shifts, as I said, to how could we let this happen in our community, to how can we learn to say something, do something to stop this from happening. Bystander intervention also changes social norms around sexual violence and sexual harassment. With bystander intervention, society's collective responsibility takes priority over an individual's responsibility to act. A great example of this is the Mothers Against Drunk Driving campaign, which instead shifted social norms of our society where folks were, drunk drove quite frequently, instead to friends don't let friends drunk drive, which is a really important shift, right? Because it promotes that there's a community responsibility to stop folks from making the decision to drive drunk. It would be interesting, I think, to really shift that to sexual violence, right? Like friends don't let friends rape people, maybe? And instead makes it so that it is the responsibility of the community that surrounds you to prevent this type of violence. And the final reason is that bystander intervention, or using bystander intervention, shifts the responsibility from preventing sexual violence to just women to all genders. I know that the conversation around sexual violence does seem to be very cisgendered, where women are typically portrayed as victims and men are portrayed as the abusers. And this is just not reflective of the actual reality because anybody can be a perpetrator and anybody can be a victim. So bystander intervention reflects the accurate way that our community experiences sexual violence. And so let's see, I think I shift ahead. Oh yes. So again, bystander intervention really just recognizes the real lived experiences of victims and responds directly to that. Okay. Let's go to the next slide, Chelsea. And we're going to talk about literally how do you do bystander intervention, right? Because we've been talking about it, and now we're really just going to dive in. This is what you do. So first, you notice an event. You look in, you notice, right? Then you recognize that there is a problem, right? Something doesn't look right, and maybe something needs to be done, right? Then you realize, okay, something needs to be done. I'm going to do that something. I'm responsible for acting right now. I'm going to take that responsibility. Then you decide how to respond appropriately and safely for you, but for everybody around, and especially for the person experiencing this violence. And number 5, you take action. You do the thing you decided you were going to do. Yeah, so it's just 5 steps, pretty easy. Let's instead though, like dive into these steps, right? Because it does seem pretty simple, but let's like break this down so you're able to actually do it. Chelsea, will you go to the next slide? So first, notice an event. I know I don't know about you, actually. I'm a huge people watcher. I'm not sure if this is because of the work that I do, or I was always a people watcher before this happened. I'm not sure. But I generally am always looking around. And so I'm encouraging you to kind of take that similar approach and just notice what's happening around you. Warning signs that something is off is when someone who acts physically or sexually aggressive toward another person, and that person who is experiencing those actions appears uncomfortable. We can also talk about someone who is talking about sex with others in ways that is making those people appear uncomfortable or could be coercive. Or talking about sex or sexual violence in a way that is demeaning. For the most part, though, Chelsea and I think just trust your instincts. If something seems off, it honestly probably is. I think it's a fine now, right, to provide like a little example. Once when I was living in New York City, I took the R train every day to go to and from work. One day on my return back, I noticed that there was a man sitting like a little bit away from me, and he was like angling his cell phone to the girls that were in like schoolgirl uniforms. He was angling to them, and I was like, well, that seems like weird, right? And so I decided to trust my instincts and kind of look over and see what he was doing. It turns out that he was like showing he was looking at violent pornography on his phone and I guess like trying to get the girls to watch it. That's the incident, right? That's the event. Chelsea, your face looks very concerned. We'll go through it, right? So the next thing, right? I recognize that there is a problem here. This man is making me uncomfortable, and I imagine he is making the girls uncomfortable because they are kind of shifting and not really looking at him. And so I started to ask myself, if I don't intervene, like, what could happen? I mean, he could start to engage them verbally, right? He could try to follow them home. I mean, I don't know. Point is, it definitely could be worse. And that final question, if this was a loved one, like if this was my little sister or if this was my younger cousin, would I want someone to intervene? Hell yes. Hell yes, I would want someone to intervene, because that is creepy and gross and he should stop doing it. So then the third thing, I'm taking responsibility. I'm taking responsibility for acting, right? It's on me. I'm annoyed. I'm looking at him. I notice that this is weird. I don't really see anybody else kind of reacting. I'm going to do it. So number 4, right? I need to decide how I'm going to act. And right on this slide, we have 3 different ways that you can respond appropriately and safely to an incident that you perceive as violent or, yeah. So directly responding, you can take responsibility and directly respond to the person that is acting violently or inappropriately. In my scenario, that's not really a scenario because it's a real experience. Directly responding can look like me turning to the man and saying, "You're disgusting. Stop doing that. Put your phone away," right? It's one thing I can do. Distracting. I can start to interact with the girls, right? Invite them to sit somewhere else or do something so that he's no longer the center of attention for them. Or I can delegate. I can look around the subway car and see if there's somebody else who could intervene in another way that I think is more appropriate. In the chat box, I would like you to take a guess as to how I actually responded. Do you think I directly responded to this man? Do you think I tried to distract him or distract the girls? Or do you think I delegated? I'm gonna pause for a second. Direct response, shocking.
I have a few ideas.
I bet you responded. Distraction, distract the girls. It's interesting. Folks are, oh, Michelle, I think you would have directly responded, but I would distract. Yeah. so folks are coming in with two different ideas that I would directly respond or I would distract. And I think this is a really great example because either decision is a good one. And so in this incident, I was really comfortable with directly responding to this man because he was alone. And I took stock of the situation and I was like, I can directly respond to this man in a way that will allow me to stop this incident, but will also allow me to express myself fully. And so I'm going to do that. And so I made the decision to directly respond to him. And I turned to him and I said, "You're disgusting." Spoiler alert, I really said that. "You're disgusting. To get that off your phone and sit somewhere else away from those girls." He then turned to me and was like, "I don't know what you're talking about, blah, blah, blah." But the point of the matter is that he put his cell phone away. And then that gave the girls an opportunity to just kind of walk off the subway. And I ended up never even speaking to them. So I'm not even really sure if they knew what he was doing. But it was gross and weird. And I'm glad I did something because I really don't know what he would have done. I don't know how he maybe would have interacted with them, what he might have said to them, if he would have followed them. You know, I'm 28 and I can think of like 5 incidences as a teenager that kind of were like this, except I was the teenager on the subway. And so, yeah, I'm happy I did it. But I think distraction is also a good idea. And I could have just distracted the girls, right? Could have just asked them, "Oh my God, that's a super cute backpack. Where did you get it?" Easy. Right? Or, "Oh my God, I think I was supposed to get off at the last subway stop. What's the next one? How do I even get to Broadway Junction?" Exactly. So easy. Let's see. So in delegating, could have just asked other folks around, right? Let's actually go to the next slide, right? And then we talk about taking action. So as you're taking action, as I took that action in my fun little scenario, it was really important to me that I was being safe, right? Because things could have turned a different way. But I feel really confident that the way that I took that action, again, refocused that man's attention either onto me or onto something else. And I'm happy with that final outcome. But it's important to remember that I'm not responsible for that final outcome. If it had turned differently, that's not my fault because I'm not the person perpetuating violence, right? I'm not that person with a cell phone. Instead, I'm the person that is looking out for the community because that's just not appropriate for teenage girls to be around. It's just not appropriate. So let's see. Let's go to the next slide, Chelsea, because another subway example. Do you want to introduce it?
Yeah, so we're going to take a moment to watch an example of a violent incident in which bystanders do intervene. I just want to like preface that by saying like it is disturbing for sure, but it is also really helpful as far as illustrating some of the stuff that we're talking about. So if you don't hear the audio, please let me know in the chat.
Oh no, I can't hear the audio.
Sorry, team.
Chelsea, I don't think there's any audio. Oh no.
So what you're not able to hear is the woman in the white coat saying, "Do not follow me."
Yeah. I think we can explain what happens in the video.
What, Michelle?
I think we can explain what happens in the video, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we open up, right? And it's absolute chaos, right? Like, what's happening? Two people are kicking each other. I don't know what's going on. But clearly something is happening, and it's not usual, right? And so unfortunately you can't hear it, but 3 people intervene, and they intervene in different ways. So, oh God, we named these people. So you may not have seen it, but there is a white man here. He kind of just gets in the middle of these 2 people and starts eating Cheetos. What he's doing is he's distracting, right? He is really de-escalating the situation by using his body as a physical barrier. He looks kind of like a hefty dude too, so he can definitely do that. I would absolutely not put myself in between these 2 people, because like, if you kick me, I'm going down. And so I just don't feel like that is an effective way for me to intervene. But this guy, he absolutely could do it. Let's see, there's also a Black woman who comes into the screen, and unfortunately you can't hear her, but she starts to directly respond, and she addresses the man and tells him not to follow the woman and to get away from her. And so that's directly responding. Then there is the 3rd person, and it's the 3rd person who is recording the event. At first, we don't hear them, right? And unfortunately, you don't hear them at all. But you don't hear them until right at the very end, and they say to the man who is reacting violently, "I see you, I see what you're doing, and I'm recording it." I noticed somebody on in the chat kind of talked a little bit about being the person who says, "I see you." And that's a really important role in bystander intervention, right? Because it's super safe. You don't have to interact with anybody. But instead, you're just speaking out loud to everyone in the room, everyone who's witnessing, that I see this is happening and this is wrong. And that obviously changes this whole incident.
That's something that I'll do actually pretty frequently.
That's your go-to.
Yeah, I'm in a very small city, but like if I'm about to witness somebody breaking into a car, I'll just kind of yell, "I see you," and then they're embarrassed and they stop.
Notice though that you didn't call the cops. Yeah, because it wasn't necessary in that incident, right? You know, I think in the subway incident, calling the cops would not have made a difference, right? Because the police aren't able to access a subway while it's moving. And so instead, the entire community reacted, and reacted in 3 different ways that allowed them to stay safe. You want to go to the next slide, Chelsea? Cool. Great. So we want to take some time to allow you to practice this, allow you to brainstorm how you would respond, or a variety of ways that you could respond. So again, just to remind you what the steps are. First, you notice an event. Second, you recognize if there's a problem and if action needs to be taken in order to address violence that might occur. 3, you take responsibility for acting. You're going to act in some way to address this. Number 4, you decide how you're going to respond appropriately and safely, right? You're either going to directly respond, you're going to delegate, or you're going to distract. And number 5, you're going to do the thing that you decided. You're going to do it. And you're going to stop the violence. You're going to be like a superhero. So let's jump into the next slide and start brainstorming how we would react.
What do you think about skipping the very first one for the sake of time?
I forgot what it is. Yeah, skip that one.
Okay.
Yeah,
we can send this out later to everyone so you could practice on your own. So in this first scenario, a coworker starts talking about a recent high-profile rape or domestic violence case and blames the victim or survivor for what happened. In the chat box, can you share what you might do in this situation?
This is a tough one, right? Because this probably has happened in your office.
You might ask for more information. Okay. Yeah.
To like start a conversation.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Ask for more information, go deeper, directly engage to inquire. In what ways is this the victim's fault? Like directly engage by, you know, really trying to attack that misconception. Let's see. Question their reasoning. I would say sexual violence is not the victim's fault. Boom, straight to the point. I would ask why they think the survivor is at fault. Yeah, absolutely. Tell a coworker that you believe survivors that violence isn't ever the victim's fault. Challenge them to think about what assumptions they're making. Yeah, absolutely. Discuss the historical context. I mean, this is a webinar for historians. Why not? I've been in this situation. Yeah, absolutely. I know I have. And how I respond depends a bit on who the specific coworker is. But I've also just said it is never the victim's fault. Yeah, I really like that approach, right? Because you're stating something that you're not allowing to be a debate, and you're kind of just shutting down the whole conversation. And I think in this type of situation, that could be helpful. And then maybe you could follow up with a supervisor to say, hey, we had this conversation. It's clear to me that, you know, the whole office could use an opportunity to re-up on our sexual harassment training, right? Let's see. Someone shared that there are times where you didn't respond and you wish you had. I really thank you for sharing that, because I also have memories where I felt I should have responded and didn't. And I'll be honest, those are the incidences that stay in my mind, not the incidences where I intervened. And so I really appreciate you sharing that, you know, because it's hard to feel like we didn't do enough.
Yeah, and this is really good, you know, possibly changing the subject by talking to someone else in the room. So here you're kind of simultaneously directly addressing and also distracting. You know, you're still engaging with people in this conversation. It's very good. Yeah. Yeah, these are all really great responses. And definitely, I would recommend following up with a supervisor if you can, because this is a really uncomfortable situation and potentially a hostile work environment.
I was going to say that. Yeah. Because you don't know who's listening, right? We talked about how pervasive sexual violence is, and we didn't even give you the statistics of, you know, like 1 in 4, 1 in 2 trans folks. And so like, just believe us or let us know if you want more information, that sexual violence is extremely pervasive. So it's not unlikely that someone in your workspace has personal experience with sexual violence, either as a victim, as a survivor, or a secondary survivor and family member. So even these off-cuff comments can be really painful and make it really hard for someone to excel in the workplace. Want to go to the next scenario?
Yeah. So this scenario is usually really good when NCPH meets in person. You're out of town for a conference, and after a dine around, you go to a local bar with some colleagues. You notice one of them's gotten really drunk, and there's a guy pushing your colleague to drink more and more. Eventually, he puts his arm around them and starts to lead them away from the group. What do you do in this situation?
Would you notice that this was a problem also? I wonder just like how many of you in this presentation, you know, have seen this before and didn't think anything of it. I mean, this is, like, I want you to feel like this is a safe space where you can share that, because that's a very real reaction. And that if you are not trained to look for these things, are you going to notice that this is an incident? I think it depends on how creepy the vibe is.
Yeah, I'd remind my coworker they agreed to share an Uber back to the hotel. That's great.
That's a good one. Then you're really getting them home.
Yeah, that's really great.
I'm gonna take that.
One thing that I would notice is this is a person trying to isolate someone from the group that they're with.
Yeah.
And that's one of the warning signs that I can think of. And it, you know, it does totally depend on how creepy the vibe is.
Right. Trust yourself.
But yeah, buddy system, absolutely.
Yeah. Can I share actually? Once when I was in college, I saw this kind of happen in the, you know, in the basement of a fraternity house. But I was like, ooh, that looks weird. I'm going to intervene. And so I went up to the girl and I was like, hey, I got to go to the bathroom, blah, blah, blah. Come with me. And she steps to go with me and then goes, wait, I don't even know you. And I was like, yeah, that looks weird. She goes, oh no, it's good. That's my boyfriend. Don't worry about it. And then just went back to him. And then you know what happened? Nothing happened. I moved on with my night. I was a little embarrassed. That's it.
Yeah. There's a comment here, you know, to look at the body language of the person being led away. Like, that's really great. You know, if someone looks uncomfortable, you know, there's something going on here.
Someone shared that this has happened. This experience has happened to them, and they have two ways that they could intervene. They could walk directly up to the colleague to say they have an early morning and that they should head back, or direct response, hey dude, that isn't cool. Walk away. She isn't interested. Yeah.
The bathroom technique is great, especially if you're someone who presents as the same gender.
I like the one about the piece about directly intervening. I think in this situation, that's a really good action that men can take, right? Because once these people have been separated, like, you know, we go to the bathroom, men around can say, hey dude, like, that's not cool. And really just call out that behavior. And affirm for everybody that's watching that behavior has no place in your community.
Yeah, one strategy that I'm not afraid to use is pretending that I'm drunk and spilling a drink on someone. Like, I'll pay for your laundry later. But, you know, in that scenario, then like, now we have to go to the bathroom because I need to help you clean up.
Right. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, so it's kind of like you're directly inserting yourself and also kind of distracting from the situation.
How much time do we have, Chelsea?
We've got about 20 minutes.
All right. Do you want to do one more scenario and then go to the final scenario?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's do one of the most complicated ones. These are great points, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah. I really appreciate how everyone is sharing how common these scenarios are, that you've experienced them. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is something that is really challenging. Yeah. A coworker discloses that the president of your organization tried to pressure them into beginning a sexual relationship with him, and now they fear being fired for resisting his advances. What are your next steps?
You know, if this was a conversation that you were having right now, what is the next thing that you would say? Someone asks, do we have an HR office? Great question. Reach out to the HR person if available. Document the conversation. Believe them, listen, figure out what help there is for the situation. Trusted board member. Yep. Someone shared that it seems like HR protects the organization, not the individual. So suggesting that, you know, maybe there are other avenues. I would go to HR and report an anonymous tip. Wow, that's like really getting involved. But that's like a really great way of showing that you're part of a community, and showing your HR office that, hey, you guys are talking. Provide resources outside the organization. That's great. Yeah. Document. Yep. Chelsea and I were talking about this, how important it is for folks to know that this is a real problem. It's against the law, and that you can document it. And there is a real, I guess, accountability process here.
Depends on how much you trust the organization.
Yeah. I appreciate how many people are reaffirming that they would believe this person, right? Because, you know, this situation in the past has been seen as, you know, unlikely to happen. And so to really affirm that you believe this person, that, you know, even though they are a fellow or an unpaid volunteer and the person they're accusing is this person with all this power, you believe them.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. EEOC, awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Title VII protects workers from hostile work environments that includes sexual harassment or sexual violence. And so there is an accountability measure that you can go to for this. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Leave the workplace together in that moment, right? And start to safety plan, find ways to remove them from working closely with the offended person until next steps can take place. Yeah, that's totally agree, Jessica. Great idea. Cool. Chelsea,
Yeah.
maybe the next one so that we can get folks thinking about what they
Yeah.
would do in a slightly different.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
So given kind of the current ongoing situation that we're all in, we thought it would be really important to address racial violence as well, because this is a method that we can practice for a variety of situations. And it's really important to practice bystander intervention, especially in a time of social isolation and crisis.
Right.
So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle for this one.
Sure. Okay, so bystander intervention, those 5 steps never change, regardless of what type of violence you're interacting against, right? So you're still going to use those 5 steps to intervene in racial violence as you would in sexual violence. So here's our scenario. You're in line at your local grocery store. An elderly Asian man is also standing near you. Before you can check out, another customer begins to loudly harass the elderly man with racist stereotypes. What do you do? Please share in the chat box what would you do if you're literally right now hearing these this racial harassment? How are you going to respond in that moment? Remember, there are 3 ways, right, to intervene. You can delegate, you can distract, or you can directly intervene. What way would you interact in a way that you're comfortable with? Look, they're restocking the toilet paper. That's great. That's great. Distract them. They're restocking the toilet paper. That's so funny. That would work in my neighborhood because it took me 3 days to get toilet paper. Approach the elderly man. Ask if he needs help. I approach the elderly man. Yeah, absolutely. I think approaching and showing this man that you're in solidarity with him, you know, whether that's like, hey, how's it going? Da, da, da. You know, just showing him that he's not alone. Depends a bit on what's happening around me. You know, my instinct is to say, are you kidding me with this right now, to the harasser, and then talk to the person being harassed. Yeah, it's totally fine, I think, to interact directly if that's something you feel comfortable with.
I like the point about just putting your body in between people. I'm someone who is larger, and so I feel comfortable like literally just inserting my body, kind of like a blockade.
Yeah. And you don't even need to make eye contact with the person who, you know, is verbally harassing someone. You know, you're kind of a wall. I guess in this case, it's like, this is a good build the wall kind of scenario. Wow, I'm in a weird mood today.
Yeah. So we're showing a couple of images on this slide that are from the Center for Anti-Violence Education. And it shows kind of a series of actions that you can take. I do want to address the comment that was just into the chat. But yeah, I want to say that I would directly respond, but you're not always comfortable, and like that's very real.
Yeah. And that's, you know, just so okay.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's so many other ways you could interact, like using this infographic, right? You can be an active witness. So in that moment, you could turn to the person who is, you know, verbally harassing him and be like, hey man, I'm right here. I'm standing here. I'm listening. What are you doing? You know, like just saying that, or pull out your cell phone, right? And be like, just like literally just start videotaping him. Like, hey, I'm here. I'm listening. You could just be in solidarity. You can stand near the man, the elderly man. You can ask to walk with him. You can ask, hey, how you doing? Yeah, how you doing today? Really just distract him from the thing that's happening around him. Directly intervene, right? By physically or verbally stopping the thing that's happening. Turning to that person saying, hey man, what are you doing? Or like, come on man, that's gross, whatever you have to do. And you can de-escalate. There's a variety of ways you can de-escalate. You could go run and get a person that works there and bring them in. You can get a security guard. You could bring in another person and have them stand in a wall formation with you. What other ideas do you have, Chelsea?
Yeah, so to address kind of a concern in the chat too, it's definitely like a concern, like you don't want to escalate the situation.
Yep.
So maybe what you do is, you know, stand with the person who's being harassed, and maybe you don't address the situation directly. Just say like, hey, how you doing? Like, can I help walk you out?
Yeah. Yeah, by not even directly recognizing that there is a situation happening. That way that person who is verbally harassing the other person doesn't get any steam, right? You're not interacting with them.
Right. Yeah. So there's a question in the chat that I think makes for a really good transition to Q&A. If you think it would be cool to just shift to that. So there's a question, how would you show solidarity when the perpetrator is part of your public audience at work, for instance, during public engagement? And that's a really good question because that's a setting I think that a lot of folks here might find themselves in. I might do what I did earlier today, actually, when we experienced sexual harassment in our own webinar.
Oh, I forgot. I was like, what happened to you today?
For those of you who joined a little bit later, Michelle and I received messages from somebody basically just coming in to start trouble, but that were really sexually explicit and inappropriate, frankly. And, you know, you can address that directly. If you're a person who's working or leading some kind of public engagement activity, it's okay to just pause and say, hey, I see that this is going on and that's not acceptable in this environment, and I'm going to ask you to leave. That's something that's really scary, but you do have the power to say that.
Yeah, I totally forgot about that. That incident that happened today.
Yeah, and most of the time, honestly, just getting called out is enough for somebody to stop what they're doing.
Yeah, I agree. Similarly, once I was doing a panel and I was using this really cool app that allowed the audience to respond directly to my question, and then their response would go up on a screen so that everyone can see it. And I thought, I'm doing a program for college students. Like, how bad could this be? Wrong. And so there was like a group of young men that were really trying to poke fun at the entire experience. And instead I decided to engage with them directly and to take the questions they were asking seriously. So they were asking about their question was something along the lines of like, well, how do you know women aren't lying? We know women are lying. And so I took that question at face value, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to directly respond to it. And I directly responded to it. I said their like username that they used, and I made eye contact because I could just tell who it was. And I made eye contact with them, and I felt that I was able to de-escalate, right? Because they were trying to make my program into a joke. And instead I was able to use that moment to share information and model how to handle, I guess, dissent.
Yeah, and there was a question earlier too about like institutional reporting mechanisms, and so I wanted to address that kind of while we've got some time. So your workplace should have a written policy prohibiting sexual misconduct and sexual harassment. If you don't, work with your people to get a policy in place. And that policy will also apply to guests, to clients, to the public. And what I've recommended in the past and what I would continue to recommend is to have that policy publicly available, whether you make a poster or you have it on your website, so that people know what to expect when they're coming into your space and they know that that's not acceptable before they walk in. Michelle, do you have other thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really important to have a institutional mechanism for dealing with sexual violence. And I think it is something that a staff can come together and do. There are plenty of examples online of sexual harassment policies. You can reach out to Chelsea or myself, and we're happy to send you some examples. If you are working at a college, you absolutely have a sexual harassment policy. And in fact, you probably have two. You have one as an employee, so you have your Title VII rights. But then if you are a graduate student or you're taking PhD classes and you're also a student at the same institution, then you're also protected by Title IX. And there are actually different reporting mechanisms for these two different worlds. And so knowing that you have two options can also be helpful, especially as we are moving into this new undetermined time of what Title IX is going to actually look like for our students. Chelsea, do you want to go on to the slide with resources?
Yeah, I would love to.
And still feel free to share your questions in the chat box, whether that's questions from, specific incidences that you might have experienced or general questions related to sexual violence and bystander intervention.
Yeah, please feel free to ask questions in the chat box.
Yeah.
We're showing some resources to help connect you with national and state organizations working to end sexual violence. If you don't see an organization in your state listed here, you can find them through the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, Black Women's Blueprint, Casa de Esperanza, or the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. For those of you who work in the college settings, Know Your Nine is a really incredible resource. For those of you who work in museums, the Gender Equity in Museums movement is a great resource, as well as Workplaces Respond, which is a project of Futures Without Violence. Mm-hmm. So definitely recommend checking those out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
See. Someone's asking for tips to committing to taking action.
I think making sure that you don't perceive this to be like a huge cultural change. Because this isn't I find bystander intervention could be kind of easier for people to begin to think about, right? Because you don't need to start practicing all 5 steps today, right? Just start with number 1, noticing an event. And then maybe in a few weeks, start thinking about, all right, I'm noticing, how would I react now? And I find that once you start thinking about how I would react, the distance to actual reaction is not that far. Especially if you can really, if you really know yourself. And I think a lot of us really do know ourselves based on this chat. How would you react? How do you feel comfortable reacting? And then just kind of knowing how you would react. So it sort of becomes automatic. You don't even need to think about how you would react in a situation because, you have 3 ways that you're going to react. You're going to distract and you're going to delegate, and that's it. That's what you do. And that's totally fine.
Yeah, I would say too, check in with your kind of emotional self. Ask, if this was a loved one, would I want someone to intervene on their behalf?
Yeah.
Like, you can appeal to that kind of emotional urgency, you know, to maybe get over some of, or get past some of the concerns that you're having. But yeah, I would say like the more you practice, even like step 1, step 2, you know, the more comfortable you'll be.
Yeah. I'm wondering if it's easier to practice with friends or if it's easier to practice with strangers.
I would say it's harder to practice with friends and coworkers.
Yeah.
Because there are people you know and you don't want to step on their toes, but it is important to kind of encourage ourselves and everyone around us to just be better people.
So someone actually asked a question in the chat, Chelsea, that I think we should really sort of delve into. Do we have a responsibility after the event, right? As like active bystanders, we did the thing, we did our 5 steps. Do we have something we should do afterwards? You know, especially if it's in the workplace with colleagues or visitors. What do you think?
Yeah, to kind of echo actually the statement that just came in, the intervention might not always be successful. But what I would say our responsibility is first to ourselves, like, are we okay? And then to check in on the person who's on the receiving end of harassment or violence. To just check in, like, are you okay? What can I do for you? You know, how can I help?
And then I think the third thing would be to think, is this incident emblematic or a result of a system that we're in? And then can I do something to change that? That's a lot, right? And like that's all great. But even if you just do the first 5 things, that's amazing. And so like, I definitely don't want people to feel like there's a lot of pressure on them to do the bystander intervention and then follow up and then do all these things, right? Just doing the bystander intervention and preventing violence is more than enough. But if you feel like you have the capacity, like after you check in with yourself, if you have the capacity to, you know, to go to your supervisor and ask that you do a training, or you know, or to go to your supervisor and ask that, hey, can we, you know, do a training on our sexual harassment policy, whatever it is, like, that's great. But again, don't feel like it's necessary.
Yeah, and to echo the statement in the chat, you know, it goes back to believing, supporting, you know, asking what you can offer and being compassionate, for sure. Yeah. Are there any other questions? We're just past 3 o'clock, but we could handle one more, I think. Yeah. And then close things down. When you leave, I will note an evaluation will pop up. So please fill that out. There will be a chance for you to enter your email address if you would like to receive more information and, you know, info about training, resources, etc. What I'll do is I'll share the recording, the PowerPoint slides, and some resources with NCPH to distribute to folks.
Awesome.
So for those of you who may have to get going, thank you so much for joining. And for folks who might have a question, we'll be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Chelsea.
Thank you. And thank you, Michelle, for joining.